Can't believe we're less than halfway through the material, but that's okay. We're going to get through it. So let's go. All right, so now we're going to be talking about cost analysis. We talked about how much we produce. We talked about how to kind of figure out where that production meets the maximizing and utilizing the cost that we have by using it in both inputs, and where we can produce the most for the amount of money we have to put towards cost. But now we need to think about cost analysis. What does it really mean to add or to produce one more of something when it comes from a cost perspective, right? So I guess let's just keep going. First things we need to think about, the firm makes many decisions to achieve one main goal, right? That main goal is profit maximization. You want your total revenue to be as high above total cost as possible. You'd like that, right? So that's good. That's good. We want to be able to make money and profit above what this cost is. So some decisions are critical to the survival of the firm. Some decisions are irreversible or very costly to reverse. So these are things that we have to think about, because these are very serious decisions we're making where we're considering profit maximization. Other decisions more easily reversed and less critical to the survival of the firm, but they still influence profit. We need to think about this in two different bins, right? The short run and the long run. And I know we've talked about the short run and long run a lot in between all the videos so far, but let's just characterize this. So sometimes the decision you're making in the short run, it's not as mission critical, right? It's having another worker for the day. It's something like that. Well, in the long run, we might make decisions on, yeah, we're going to pull the trigger and we're going to purchase that extra building. We're going to purchase that extra building, right? In the long run, most things are variable. So we can eventually change most things in the long run, but not necessarily in the short run. In the short run, some things might be fixed. They might be irreversible once we make that decision. In the long run, we tend to have more ability to change things. So much like how we had total cost, or total product, marginal product, average product. We also have total cost, marginal cost, average cost. We also have fixed cost and variable cost and sunk cost. Don't worry. It's a lot of definitions. We got them all. I wouldn't know what the definitions are. I would recommend that, but let's think about this. So when it comes to cost, we have two real types of cost, right? So we have fixed cost and variable cost. Fixed cost, these are the things in the short run that we cannot change, right? So a lot of the time our variable costs are like the labor input. We can change how many workers we have every day, but the fixed cost in the short run tends to be the capital. Today, I cannot change how many ovens are in my bakery, right? Today, I cannot change how many pottery wheels or how many kilns are in my pottery studio. Those costs might be fixed, which means I have to pay them regardless of if we open up our doors that day or not. It's the idea of electricity, rent, like you're going to have to pay those things. Then there's variable costs. How many workers do I have that day, right? So that's part of the equation we need to think about. So our total cost, the total amount of cost that we will incur for a project, is the sum of this fixed cost. So the fixed cost right here that we have to pay regardless. So this number will always be in our cost, whether we produce one thing or 1,000 things. And then we have our variable cost. So our variable cost is a function of quantity. The more we produce, the more variable cost we have. So the variable cost increases the more and more we produce. This variable cost that increases or changes relative to the amount that we are producing, plus the fixed cost that we have to produce regardless, that is going to be our total cost. Now, there's a really good term here that we always need to think about, and that's going to be sunk cost. When you put money into a project, you're not getting back. For example, I drive a very beat up 2009 Chevy Equinox that I have put through the runner for years. And every single time I go to the junkyard to get it more parts and fix it in my front yard, that's sunk cost, right? Like it's stuck in there. This is money and resources and time I have put into this that I cannot get back, right? No one would ever pay me for this terrible Chevy Equinox, right? So resources that you've invested into something that you cannot get back out. If a firm's plant has no resale value, it's a sunk cost. If you bought a pizza oven that's specifically sized for your restaurant so no other restaurant can use it, that is a sunk cost. You can't get it back, right? Oh, all right. We have a very important graph here, and let's draw this out so that we can think about what each and every part of this graph is. So let's go down to what we had earlier. Yeah, let's get ourselves some blank area. Okay, so when we're thinking about cost, we have a couple very important pieces that we need to think about. First and foremost, we need to figure out how to graph it. So what are we really graphing at the end of the day? Well, we're going to have some amount of output, right? Let's think about this as the Q. This is some amount that we are producing. All right, then we have to think about what the costs are to produce that. Sometimes we do this per week, per day. Let's have this as per day. Yeah, that sounds good. Okay. As we increase the amount that we are producing, cost may increase too, depending on what type of cost it is. Let's go through each of them. So first we have total fixed cost. Total fixed cost, always the same, whether I produce 0, whether I produce 1,000, there's going to be some amount of total fixed cost that's going to be the same. This is like our rent, right? Whether we produce 1,000,000 ceramic mugs or 0 ceramic mugs, our rent's still going to be X amount of dollars. So we're going to call this total fixed cost. All right, so our total fixed cost, we're paying that no matter what. We also have another piece of the equation, the variable cost. So when we produce nothing, for example, the amount of workers that I need to pay for, right? If I need to hire workers, if I produce nothing, I don't have to pay any workers. There's no variable cost. No workers are coming into work that day, right? But as I produce more and more output, the more and more workers I'm going to have have working for me. And which means I'm going to have to hire them for a little bit more money. I'm going to have to get them from further away. I'm going to do stuff like that. So we have this thing called variable cost. Oops. Let's see if I can draw this. Total variable cost. Notice that it kind of stays relatively flat and then sharply goes upwards. That's because variable cost starts to get really, really expensive once we are producing well above our weight class, right? When we start producing instead of 1 or 10 or 15 ceramic mugs, when we start getting to thousands and thousands of ceramic mugs, variable cost goes up real fast. So we got our total fixed cost, total variable cost. Then remember, we got to have this total cost component. So total cost, which is a function of the amount of quantity that we are producing, is equal to a function of the variable cost. So this variable cost is also a function of quantity. That just means at 1, we have some amount of variable cost. At 10, we have some amount of variable cost. And this variable cost increases the more quantity that we are producing, plus fixed cost, which I guess we could also call this total fixed cost, total variable cost, just so we get the same notation, right? This fixed cost, that's the amount of rent no matter what. So at 0, we have the cost of the rent and 0 variable cost. At 10, we have the total variable cost plus the total fixed cost. All together, when we add these two lines together, we just get what that total cost is. So we have 3 main lines that we need to think about in this initial graph. When we're thinking about this graph, we're able to see sort of the differences in between these fixed and variable costs and what they mean for the goods and services. Oh, I'm dropping my pen. That's okay. All right, so, oh, and the blanket covering my, whatever, who cares? All right, so let's go to the next part. So this is just kind of drawing out what we're seeing here so that you're able to see what each of the pieces represent. It's just saying that, for example, in this one, if there's $25 of total fixed costs, then if we're at, for example, outputting 13 sweaters, well, then we have the $75 of variable cost plus the $25 of fixed cost, equaling to $100 of total cost for producing 13 sweaters. It's just a way that we're going to start thinking about things. Now we have to think about our short run and long run components. We're going to spend most of our time talking about short run because that's the more complicated of the two. So to produce more output in the short run, we have to hire more workers. We cannot change the capital. The capital component's fixed in the short run. We're keeping it similar to the stuff that we've already done because we're using consistent language. Our capital in the short run is fixed, but our labor is not. We can always hire more employees that day. We can always tell people to go home from work. We can always ask people to run extra shifts, right? So there's 3 main concepts in that: the total cost, the marginal cost, and the average cost. Goes along with what we had for total product, marginal product, average product, right? Total cost, marginal cost, average cost. Let's think about what that means, because this is the relationship in between the output and what it costs to output it, right? So total cost, marginal cost, average cost. Let's go through each of them in definition, and then I think I'll start drawing them out. I'll probably wait until then to do it. So a firm's total cost is the cost of all the resources used. Notice that it is the variable cost times the amount that you're producing, plus, or well, it's a function of what you're producing. So the total variable cost plus the total fixed cost, what your rent's going to be, right? So your TC equals TFC plus TVC. You can switch off which one's in front, doesn't really matter as long as you know that it's some combination of the two. This total cost is really important because at the end of the day, we want to know for our profit maximization what revenue minus cost are. Now, remember, if you're remembering all the way back to when I was talking about opportunity cost and economic profit at the beginning, we're going to incorporate opportunity cost in here later on, because opportunity cost is part of that variable cost and fixed cost component as well. And that's some of the really interesting parts of when we're trying to figure out this economic component, right? But we want to maximize profit, which means we want revenue up, cost down. So we're trying to figure out what that total cost is when we're making that equation. The next part we're going to have is the marginal cost. Now, listen to me carefully, because marginal product was how much extra product are we producing if we have one more worker, or we have one more unit of labor, or we have one more unit of capital, or we have one more machine. That is not what we have here. We're not looking at the cost of an extra machine or an extra worker. What we are looking at in this marginal cost is the increase in total cost from producing one more product, one more Q. So for each additional Q, what does that mean for the total cost, right? And that increase in the total cost, that's your marginal cost. So if we produce 10 ceramic mugs and it costs us $100 in total in material and time and labor, and then we go and we produce instead 11 coffee mugs and it costs us $110 in labor, material, so on and so forth, then the marginal cost of that 11th mug was going from $100 to $110. It's that increase in cost for producing one more, not the increase in cost for one more laborer, not the increase in cost for one more machine. That is something that always students get wrong when it comes to the quiz, when it comes to the test. So that is something that we're going to have to remember on this one, right? Marginal cost, extra that comes from a 1 unit increase in total product. Now, we have some things that have increasing marginal returns, and we have some things that have diminishing marginal returns. These are things that you probably hear about all the time that we have to think about, break down the nuances of the words. What does that actually mean? So over the output range, over the amount of possible things that we can produce with increasing marginal returns, which means for each additional if you remember back, each additional laborer, each additional machine, we're getting more and more back from it. Over that point where that marginal product is increasing as we are adding something, then on the marginal cost side, the marginal cost is going down, because that extra worker is super productive, or that extra machine is super productive. That's what we had a couple videos ago when I was talking about going from like 1 worker to 2 worker in the donut shop, where you had 1 person in front, 1 person in back, and they were able to get things done more efficiently than 1 person running around and doing every job in the store. At that point, we had increasing marginal returns. 2 people were actually more productive than if we had 2 separate places with 1 person each at first. So, and during that period of increasing marginal returns, which might happen for the first couple of workers or the first couple of machines, marginal cost falls as output increases, because it's just more, it's more productive, right? Then we have that part that, remember, the marginal cost curve started sloping downwards. This is a majority of what we see, is that as we decide to add in another worker, or we decide to add in another machine, that there is diminishing marginal returns to it. We're getting less and less extra donuts for each extra worker we put in the building, right? Because we're still stuck with the same number of ovens, we're still stuck with the same number of cash registers. So the more workers we throw in the building, the less and less extra donuts we get for each additional worker if we are not increasing the machines as well, which means that we have diminishing marginal returns to that amount of workers, right? When we have diminishing marginal returns, when that extra person or that extra machine is giving us a little bit less each time, this is when marginal cost is actually rising, because that means the more we're producing, the more expensive it is to produce that next unit of a good, right? So is that cool? Like, I know you can't like hear me and I can't hear you respond back, but I'd like to think that some of y'all just went, whoa, because like that's kind of cool when we start thinking about what this relationship in between products are and this relationship in between costs, because guess what? They work hand in hand. So if we understand one, we can understand both. All right, so marginal cost, super cool. That's when we're thinking about like what the additional cost for producing one more of something is or not. Then we have the idea of average cost. And in that, we also have 3 things. There's so many definitions during this, but I promise when you practice it, it's not that bad. So remember, marginal cost is the cost of producing one more of a good. Average cost can just be derived from what's the amount of cost per good, right? So, you know what, let's actually write this out. Let's write this out. I think there's going to be sort of a way that this one tends to confuse people. Let's think about it. So our average fixed cost, right? Or well, let's start with average total cost. Average total cost. Well, this right here, that's going to be ATC, which is going to be equal to AVC, our average variable cost, plus our average fixed cost. Let's break down what that means. Let's say that to produce 10 mugs, it cost us $100 in total cost, right? I'm coming up with these numbers off the top of my head, so I hope they all work out. We'll find out. So, well, we know that this total cost has two components to it, right? We know that we're going to have the fixed cost component and the variable cost component. There's going to be like the rent and stuff that we're going to pay regardless. And there's going to be the variable cost, like, oh, okay, well, some of this was because we produced 10 mugs, we had to have so many workers. So first, we need to think about the average total cost. Well, the average total cost is that $100. So total cost divided by the quantity that we produced, right? So $100 divided by the 10 mugs. So our average total cost in this case equals, let's say, just 10. Cool. All right. Well, how much of that 10 is this average variable cost plus the average fixed cost? Oops. Well, let's think about that part too. Let's say if I were to tell you about this $100, that maybe 10 of this $100 went to rent, while 90 of this went to paying the employees that I needed to hire to be able to do the mugs. Okay, all right, sure. So that $10 for the fixed cost. So we know that $10 went to fixed cost. Average fixed cost is just dividing it by the quantity. So $10 divided by the 10 mugs that we produced means that of this $10 of average total cost, the average fixed cost is $1. All right. Now let's think about the variable cost. If we have $90 of variable costs, so that total cost, 10 went to rent, 90 went to workers. If we have $90 in variable cost divided by the 10 mugs that we produced, that means that our variable cost is $9. This $9 plus this $1, those together equal out this $10 of average total cost, which is $10 per mug. Yeah. So do you see that when we take the average total cost, it's not just taking the total cost and dividing it by the quantity. I mean, it partially is, but we have to think about how much of this came from fixed cost and how much of this came from variable cost, right? So as we have it right here, it's just fixed cost is the fixed cost divided by quantity. Variable cost is the variable cost, which remember is a function of the amount of quantity that you are producing divided by the quantity. Average total cost, adding them together. It is just the total amount that you spent divided by the amount that you produced. Woo! All right, we are getting there. We are getting there. Actually, before we even do this, back to graphing again. I know that this is probably annoying to watch me draw at every graph. I do this because I understand how confusing the slides and material can be, and I don't want you to be in a tough spot. So let's go back and let's think about, so we had our total cost earlier, we had our variable cost, we had our fixed cost, but remember that those were totals, total fixed cost, total variable cost. Now let's start doing it when we start thinking about this average piece and we start thinking about the variable piece. So let's have our output, which is Q. In the slides, I use an example of sweaters because it's the one that I use in my undergrad class and it's a little bit easier. If you're following along in the Principles of Micro lecture things that I made available in case you wanted it for more information, you do not have to watch them. You're not required to watch them, but if you want them, I think this is chapter 10 or 11. It's one of the later ones. So then we have costs, which let's just say that this is in dollars, right? So we're going to have some relationship in between output and cost. Well, first we need to think about average fixed cost. So when we have, let's say the rent's $10, right? Cheapest rent that you've ever had, cheapest rent anybody's ever had since, you know, the 1820s, but whatever. If we have rent that's $10, then if we produce one mug, then that is a lot of fixed cost, right? That's $10 divided by 1. That's pretty high up there. If we instead produce 10 mugs, okay, then that's $10 for that fixed cost divided by 10 mugs. So that's $1. Notice that as we go down, the more and more mugs that we produce, the more we're spreading that fixed cost. The more stuff that you produce, the more you kind of like spread the rent payment across them. We call this average fixed cost. Notice that it is decreasing. Okay, well, that's the average fixed cost. If we have the average fixed cost, we're going to need the average variable cost. Average variable cost is actually very, very similar to the marginal product curve. So the marginal product curve, remember, as we added in these initial workers, they are very, very productive. And then eventually they start getting less productive because if we're not increasing the number of machines or the number of capital, the additional amount of workers that we have are less productive. So that means to produce the same amount, when we start adding more workers, once they become less and less productive, we're going to need more of them. So our average variable cost curve can start to go down initially because at first people are relatively productive, right? And then let's bring it over here. And then it starts to go back up. It starts to get more expensive because the more and more we produce of something, the more we're going to need workers from further away. They're going to get more expensive. It becomes a little bit of a hassle, right? So let's say that that's the average variable cost. Remember, much like when we were adding together total fixed cost and total variable cost, that we shifted it upwards to have our total cost line. Well, much like in this one, we're going to have our average total cost. Average total cost is just average fixed cost and average variable cost together, right? So we're going to have some amount that is typically above these two. So let's say like this, average fixed cost. That's just saying at this point, so let's say we had 10, maybe this is $1, maybe this is, I don't know, $6 for the average, $6 for the average variable cost, and maybe this right here, this might be $7 in total cost, right? It's adding together this piece plus this piece. So I guess 3 plus whatever amount to get up here. All right, so adding those two together, that's how we get our average fixed, or our average total cost. I just realized that my F looked like or my T looked like an F there. Let's not do that. All right, so what do we do with this? We have our average fixed cost, we have our average variable cost, we have our average total cost, but what has this told us about the most effective amount to produce? Let's clean it up a bit because I don't like how messy this has gotten. Average total cost. Well, the total amount that we should produce, or what would be most cost efficient for us to produce, or actually the most efficient amount for us to produce whatsoever, is going to be related to the marginal cost, right? How much in addition is it costing us to produce each thing, right? So if I go from 1 mug, where I have to pay the $10 rent plus the cost of materials plus the labor, to 2 mugs, right? How much is the additional cost for that second mug? Well, the additional cost for that second mug, that's going to be like how much I pay workers, right? And how much it's going to cost me for extra machines and things like that. We call that marginal cost. So we're going to have a marginal cost curve. Let's do this. So a marginal cost curve looks like a check mark. Marginal cost always looks like a swoopy check mark, right? Because eventually marginal cost goes down as we are being more and more productive, and then it goes up because the more laborers we add to a kitchen, the less good they do an extra each, right? If we have 2 workers, all right, then they're able to split the job, but when we have 10 workers, not as useful. Notice that this hits at what's supposed to be the bottom of the average total cost curve and what is supposed to be the bottom of the average variable cost curve. That's because this tells us where we can minimize average variable cost, or the quantity that we can produce to minimize average variable cost. It also tells us the quantity that we can produce to minimize average total cost. We want to minimize average total cost because that's where we're going to be really maximizing the profit that we're going to make, because it's minimizing the amount of total cost while we're increasing the amount of product that we're going to sell at prices. So we're going to have high total revenue minus low total cost to equal out the profit. And that is the goal. So if you hate my drawing and you think that my art is atrocious, because believe me, I think so too, let's go ahead and go back to this. So we see that the short run cost, I go ahead and describe each of these pieces in the slides in case you don't want to hear me talk about it, understandable. But this figure shows, well, right now it just shows the average fixed cost, average variable cost. We're going to add in a couple things, right? But notice that the average fixed cost falls. That's because you're spreading out your fixed cost over more things that you are producing. And the average variable cost is U-shaped. That's because at first variable cost goes down when things are being more productive, but eventually they get more and more expensive because each additional worker, if I want to produce 5 extra mugs instead of initially 1 extra worker, I might need 2 or 3 extra workers because we still have the same number of machines. All right, so as output increases, average variable cost falls to a minimum. All right, average fixed cost plus average variable cost equals that balloon right there. That's average total cost, just putting the 2 of them together. Notice that then we have the marginal cost swoop. It looks like a backwards check mark or forward check mark. I actually don't know which direction a check mark should go. Anyways, so we see some amount of output that minimizes the average variable cost. This is a great amount. We're happy there because this is the point where we don't have to shut down. If we can at least match the average variable cost, we're like, you know what, we can afford to bring in workers, because even if we lose money, the amount that we're losing is not as much as or is not as high as our cost. All right, then we have our average total cost, which is just going to be another relationship looking at, okay, well, where can we minimize cost, right? Because we want to minimize cost because we want to produce as much as possible. So we kind of go through some examples here. You can read them if you want to, but there's shifts in those cost curves. They don't always look like that. Well, they always have the same general shape, but they might extend outwards. They might get deeper. They might have higher slopes. They might have more curvature to them. They might, marginal cost might take a little bit longer to become less productive, right? This depends on two real factors. The first one's going to be technology. How good has technology gotten? There's a big difference in between producing pizzas and thinking about our output per hour when we have a wood stove versus when we have one of those like Domino's convection ovens that you can just shoot pizzas through, right? And you can produce so many an hour. There's a huge difference in technology, which also affects the cost of being able to produce each unit of a good. We also have to think about the price of the factors of production. How much our marginal cost is really going to be affected by how much the wage rate is, but not how much the rental rate is in the short run. But it is the wage rate. The average total cost, that's also going to be affected by the price of the factors of production, right? All right, so let's think about technology. Technological changes influence both the product curve and the cost curve. It lets you produce more and for a lower cost when there are increases in technology. An increase or production shift in the product curve upwards puts the cost curve downwards. So notice that the product curves, remember that they swooped upwards, it pushes them up, while our total cost curves swoop downwards, it would push those down, lengthening the difference in between the product curve and cost curve. When we see this, we have technological advancements that let us produce more for a lower cost. That's good, right? We are happy in that, because this means that this technological advancement results in the firm using more capital and less labor, and then there's fixed cost increases and variable cost decreases. So like, yeah, fixed cost goes up because it turns out machines are expensive, but your variable cost of the labor to run those machines go down. So once we start thinking about like short run versus long run perspectives, that could be major differences in profits. So in this case, average total cost would increase at low levels of output. Like if we had to buy a really expensive machine and we only produce one or two things, like it's going to be very expensive. But as we increase the amount we output, as we increase 10 mugs or 20 mugs or 40 donuts or whatever else we need to for large amounts of output, the average total cost goes down because you're spreading the cost of making the technology better over more things. And then you need less labor to make those things, which means their cost reduces. And that is just so freaking nifty. All right. So we have to think about the price of the factors of production as well. If all of a sudden minimum wage goes up in your state, or all of a sudden it becomes standard in your industry to offer a very expensive benefits package to each of your workers, or if there's a chip shortage like we've been experiencing, if there's a chip shortage and it becomes much harder to get the products that you need for that capital input, like that could change your price schematics, right? An increase in the price of a factor of production increases the cost. If it is more expensive to get your machines, your costs have gone up. If your laborers and workers get raises, it is more expensive to produce things. An increase in your fixed costs, which in the short run, our fixed cost is capital. This shifts the total cost curve and the average total cost curve, but it doesn't shift marginal cost. If your fixed cost, your technology is more expensive, well, you have to pay for the technology regardless. Your variable cost, right, and your marginal cost, that's just related to kind of the cost of your workers. The marginal cost of producing one more of something, you have to employ one more worker. So the marginal cost curve is not really affected by the change in the fixed cost component. If it's the variable cost component, though, let's say that Wages have gone up, right? Well, then that's not only going to affect your total cost, it's going to affect your average total cost, and it's going to affect your marginal cost, because for each additional worker I bring in to produce one more of things, or to have one more thing, the amount of workers that I need to hire to be able to produce that thing, that's going to shift our marginal cost curve upwards, because that additional worker is more expensive. So we're getting there. We're getting there. We've made it through most of the material. Let's think about the production function. The production function is how much we are producing. In the long run, everything's variable. We can always change the capital and we can change the labor in the long run. All the costs are also variable, right? All the inputs are variable, all the costs are variable. The behavior of the long run cost depends upon the firm's production function, right? How much I can produce for each capital input versus how much I can produce for each labor input. The firm's production function is the relationship between the maximum output obtainable, how much I can produce, and the quantities I have of capital and labor, right? It's that relationship between, if I have 10 workers and 20 machines, how much can I produce? That's our production function. That's just so neat. So when everything is variable, we've talked a lot about when some things are fixed, right? When some things are fixed, we only have one of these average total cost curves. When both things are variable, say that this is the long run, then we can make decisions on the amount of capital that we have. If we can make decisions on the amount of capital that we have and the amount of labor that we have, that means when we're making decisions, we're not choosing where we are on one average total cost curve. We are making decisions based upon which total cost curve we are on, and then the nuances in between it. So for example, if I have one machine, right, this is the average total cost curve 1, this is how the total cost changes as I'm increasing my production with one machine. So as I'm producing or changing production, I'm going to have to hire more workers and stuff for that one machine. And this is how much I can produce. The next one I have, this average total cost curve 2, this is assuming I have 2 machines and looking at the cost relationship that might happen when I have 2 capital inputs. When I'm going along and I'm choosing in between that average total cost curve with two capital inputs, then this is variable based upon the amount of labor inputs I have. Average total cost 3, that represents 3 machines. Average total cost 4 is 4 machines. And you're wondering, like, which one do I choose? Well, when we're debating in between an amount of labor and an amount of capital, and we have multiple average total cost curves, we always want the one that minimizes the average cost. So for example, if I wanted to produce 10 sweaters, I see right here that I can do that with either 1 or 2 machines. If I want to produce 15 sweaters, we notice that 2 machines can do it for the lowest average total cost. 2 machines and whatever amount of workers are needed for this amount. If we wanted to produce 24 sweaters, well, it doesn't make sense to do that with only 2 machines. We might instead need 4 machines to be able to produce that much output. Or 3, I guess you could do it with 3 or 4 to be able to minimize this amount. And that is just cool. So there's 2 main things that we need to understand from this. And first is the idea of economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. Economies of scale mean as I am producing more and I am getting more capital and I am getting more labor, there's good things that happen from increasing, right? As I am able to do things for a lower and lower cost, the more capital that I am willing to put into a project. But then there's also diseconomies of scale where costs are going to start increasing, right? And they're going to start increasing regardless of this capital input. Let's look at what the definitions of these are when we start thinking about scale versus scope, because you've probably heard of economies of scale and you've probably heard of economies of scope. Economies of scale are when there are cost savings by increasing the level of production. That's the idea of, like, you're making, I don't know, I keep going back to mugs. Let's say you're making mugs, right? And you're like, oh, this is cool. Pretty tasty, nice. All right, so we're making mugs. Okay, well, it does not make sense for me to build a factory, hire workers, get the pottery wheel, everything else for 1 mug, right? Maybe it makes more sense for me to produce like 100 mugs, because then I'm spreading out my average fixed cost over a lot of things. Maybe getting 10 is like the right amount of level production for me. I get economies of scale because I'm having a lot of cost savings, because yeah, I might have to get an extra pottery wheel, but like we've gotten to the point where we have reached a good amount of capital and labor where I have minimized that cost. There's also diseconomies of scale. No matter what, if you start producing more and more and more, eventually that cost is starting to become more expensive relative to the prices that you can get back for your good or service. If I go to producing 10,000 mugs, that's expensive. That's diseconomies of scale, right? Because I'm not going to be able, if I'm making 10,000 mugs, I will not be able to sell them for very much, and my costs are going to skyrocket. Costs are going to go up because I'm going to have to start getting materials from further and further away. I'm going to have to start bussing in employees. I'm going to have to start paying people a lot of money to work at my job instead of other jobs. There's eventually going to be losses. So there's cost savings at first with economies of scale, and there's diseconomies of scale when costs increase faster. There's also the economies of scope. The economies of scope, where the idea is there's savings by producing a wider variety of products. Instead of just having the ceramic mug, maybe I can also have, I don't know, these prefabricated mugs. I drink a lot of tea and coffee, so I have to have one for coffee and one for tea. Don't judge me. I also have a teapot right here. So if we wanted to produce lots of different things, right? So we wanted to have our tea, we wanted to have our coffee, we wanted to have everything else. Maybe there's an economy of scope where, okay, well, I already bought the materials to be able to mold a teacup. I already may have the materials to be able to put into any of these machines. Maybe it would make sense for me to have a wider variety of products, because maybe if I'm not only producing mugs, which as I'm producing more and more of them, people won't pay me as much. If I produce mugs and prefabricated coffee mugs, maybe I might be able to have some amount of cost savings from that. Economies of scope is the idea of having a wider variety of products. And when the cost of producing two or more items is less than producing each separately, right? Where instead of having one company that produces ceramic and one that does prefab, there might actually be cost savings for one company just producing both. The idea of like steaks and hides, right? If you're producing hamburger steaks and the leather that comes from like cows, it doesn't really make sense for there to be a leather company that wastes a whole bunch of meat and a meat company that wastes a whole bunch of leather. Sometimes it makes sense for the company to do it together and to produce both. Wow. So there's a role to the manager in this. We got back to managerial econ. Don't worry. The math is behind us. Draw it out, go through examples. I'll give you more examples, but now let's just talk about the funner things, right? Kind of the role of the manager in this. So the role of the manager is to procure inputs in the least costly manner. Your role as a manager is to understand in some nuanced way what this average fixed cost spread over more things means, and what the average variable cost decreasing and then increasing means, and what the marginal cost of producing one more of something, what that means at the end of the day. That's the role of the manager, is being able to efficiently procure inputs that you can produce the most amount of things with for the least amount of cost possible. And this provides incentives. And another role is to be able to provide incentives, right? You want your workers to come there, and sometimes you want it to be low cost. So maybe there's different ways that you can incentivize workers. Like maybe there's a bonus structure, or maybe there's partial ownership, or maybe there's many of the other ways that you can provide incentives to potential workers. Then there's the idea that managers also need to understand different points on this total cost line, and to be able to use the inputs efficiently and to acquire inputs for the least costly method to be able to get to the point on the total cost line in which is best for your company relative to the total revenue that you can get from the profit, which comes from the total profit, which means that we have to understand our total, total product, average product, marginal product, total cost, average cost, marginal cost, and all the nuances of the ones within that. So how do we procure inputs? How do managers actually go buy things, right? Well, there's a few different ways you can do that, and we'll talk about each of them. The first one that we like to think about is the idea of a spot exchange. So there's good and bads to all of these different things. Spot exchange is when the buyer and seller of an input meet, exchange, and then go their own separate ways. That's the idea of like, I'm making ceramic mugs. I'm really out of like these little handle pieces, so I'm going to go meet up with someone, and I'm going to just purchase these little handle pieces from them, and then we're going to go our own separate ways. We're not going to have any sort of continuing relationship. I bought it once, right? Well, there's some good and bad that can come from that. That person can screw me over in the exchange. They could rip me off. But there's also benefits of I can do it very quickly. I'm not negotiating a long-term contract. I can get my stuff right then, right now. Speaking of contracts, instead of spot exchanges, which is a one-time purchase, there's the idea of having established long-term relationships with a single type of buyer or seller, right? Contracts are legal documents that create an extended relationship. It's the idea of saying like, I will buy my clay to make these ceramic mugs or whatever from you for a set price for the foreseeable future. The thing is, sometimes there's cost savings to this, which are really nice, but you can't shop around for better prices if you have a contract where you have to buy from one dealer, right? You can't search around for places that might be able to have better technology or a better product or anything else like that if you have an established buying relationship with one contract. So it's great that you always have someone to purchase from, but it's stopping you from being able to find the next best thing from purchasing somewhere else. So there's the idea of contracts. So you can purchase your goods or services through spot exchanges, you can purchase them through contracts, or there's the idea of vertical integration. This is when a firm shuns other suppliers and chooses to produce it internally. That's the idea of saying like, okay, well, I see that this requires both clay and glaze, right? The stuff that makes the pretty colors and shiny. Maybe instead of purchasing the glaze from someone, we're just going to produce it ourselves. We're going to make this ourselves. Like we are done with suppliers. We are going to produce this ourselves. We get cost savings because we don't have to like pay a middleman, right? But we may not do it well. And then also that means that we are putting some of our resources and our cost into producing that thing. So there's good and bads to it. Actually, let's talk about the features of the good and bads. Spot exchanges, there's lots of speculations. You have to think about one-time contracts like, am I really getting a good deal? Well, I'm not going to have to pay a contract cost and all the negotiations and the lawyers and stuff. But these people could really mess me up. They could sell me something bad or a bad product. There could be a holdup problem where like I try to purchase once from someone and they just don't show up with the product on time because they don't have a contract that ends up punishing them for that. Contracting, there's the idea of like, okay, well, now we can find someone who finds a very specialized product, and it kind of reduces opportunism. So someone's not going to take as much advantage of me, and we can avoid these sketchy and speculative one-time arrangements. But it's costly and complex and requires lawyers and keeping up with your contract and making sure that you are purchasing your things exactly how you had agreed to, and keeps you from other opportunities. Then there's the idea of vertical integration. Producing it yourself, it also reduces opportunism. People can't take advantage of you when you're the person who's making it for yourself. But avoid contract costs. You're not going to have to pay for these expensive contracts, but you're going to lose specialization. You're no longer making one good. You're now making many goods, and you may incur organizational costs. If I wanted to make the glaze for my mugs along with the mugs, that's a whole nother building, right? That's hiring another department. That's getting a new specialist. That's doing a whole bunch of other things that might be an organizational cost to being able to produce this additional good or service. Then we have to think about transaction costs. Like that's a whole other world in and of itself, right? Transaction costs are the cost of acquiring an input above and beyond the amount paid for the input supplier, right? When you purchase something, it's not just the price tag that you pay, because remember, we are economists, and economists don't only pay the sticker price when we think about the opportunity cost. We are also spending a search cost, the amount of time and resources that it took us to like research and figure out who to buy from. That's a search cost. There's paying for the lawyers to negotiate a contract or to be able to work with someone to figure out a price. We have the time and resources it took for the search cost, the negotiation cost, the ones for other investments and expenditures that we need for the system. There's a whole bunch of other costs besides just the price tag for the glaze for the ceramic mugs. There is searching for the suppliers. There's negotiating with the suppliers. There's investment into certain types of companies to make sure that they succeed. There's lots of transaction costs that go in with every single purchase that a company makes. And understanding that is having a good manager, right? Some transaction costs are very general. It just might be the idea of like, I need to have a professional buyer, right? Someone in my company whose job is to go buy from other companies. While some are very specific to the trading relationship. Like, for example, if you have a contract with the school for a consulting project, there might be some very specific pieces of that trading relationship, like saying you may not go to another school for a certain part of the thing, or you might have to pay for a very specific set of data for them to work with to be able to give you all the things that you need, right? There might be specific extra costs for that independent trading relationship. So transaction costs are huge, and it's something that we need to think about when it comes to these markets. One very important part of transaction costs that we always need to think about and consider are tariffs from trades, right? Told you this would be a short part, but it's not even going to be its own video, because guess what? It is one slide. My gift to you. A tariff is a tax that's imposed by one country on a good or service imported from another country. You've probably heard about this a lot in the news because it's something that's debated very frequently. Why have the cost of certain types of whiskey skyrocketed in the United States in the past 3 years? It's because there has been a tariff and trade issue with being able to bring in certain types of distilled spirits, which has caused prices to rise because it's an additional type of tax that's imposed, right? Why is it during the coronavirus pandemic, at the very, very beginning of it, back when there were some, what was it? It was the trade deals with aluminum. So not only did we end up having a supply shortage of aluminum, you couldn't really import more aluminum because of the very expensive tariffs made it just too expensive to be able to do so. So there was actually a point in time where they thought there may not be any more cans for sodas or for other things like that, because it might have been too expensive to be able to purchase the needed amount of aluminum for these goods. That all just boiled down to the fact that there was a tax imposed by one country on the goods and services imported from another country. And when you put a tariff on one good going to a different country, they will often put a tariff on your good coming into their country. So there's extra taxes all around, and tariffs are often reciprocal. When you put a tariff on the goods of one country, that country almost always puts tariffs on the goods of your country. Governments impose tariffs for the ability to be able to raise revenue. Some of these are for environmental reasons, like there's tariffs across certain types of plastic for the purpose of being able to raise money to deal with the environmental damage to those types of plastic. Some are to protect domestic industries. Why are there huge tariffs in agriculture? Because it's trying to encourage Americans to buy from domestic farmers instead of international farmers who might have an additional tax for you to purchase from. Or exert political leverage over another country. We see this a lot when there might be an additional tax. We see that other countries will put in a tax as well to be able to try to put political leverage on should you keep a policy or not. Tariffs often result in unwanted side effects. Almost always, actually, I can't really think of an example where this doesn't happen. Pretty much always tariffs result in unwanted side effects in higher prices. So consumers end up paying higher prices for those same goods. And they have kind of a contentious history, but they're very commonly used today. And that's part of the transaction cost that we need to think about when we're thinking about this product versus cost example. So this week, what we've done is we've gone through a lot of the total products. We've gone through the marginal products. We've gone through the cost side of the transaction. We've talked a little bit about transaction costs and what we need to think about when we're thinking about cost. And I think next week we continue further into that, but also doing parts of the regulation pieces of it. So this is a great place to stop before we start getting into the idea of profit maximization and how to do the math behind profit maximization. So if you have any questions, like always, feel free to tell me. It's been wonderful working with y'all, and I will see you again. Bye.